name is Elena Garcia, and I am a horticulture professor at the University of Arkansas, where I have been conducting fruit research for several years. And today I'm going to be talking to you about some of our projects that we have conducted on comparing the productivity and growth and performance of blackberry production under high tunnels and field conditions. I know most of you know what high tunnels are, but let me refresh your memory by giving you a definition. High tunnels are passively heated and ventilated plastic cover structures that provide an intermediate level of environmental protection and control compared to open field conditions and greenhouse conditions. Now, tunnels are, as far as environmental control and protection, they are in between the field conditions, which has really no environmental or protection, and the greenhouses, where the environment is highly controlled. So some of the advantages of high tunnels relative to field production include, first, the season extension. In that, because the tunnel is covered in plastic, it's going to start warming up faster than in the field, so this allows for the plants to start accumulating more heat units, and so they begin growing faster, and so you can extend the season in the spring, but also in the fall when the days are getting colder. You can still conserve some heat in there. In the daytime they get hotter than in that field conditions, and therefore you can extend the season for the fall time. Another advantage of high tunnels is that because they are covered, there is no rainfall on those plants, and so right there, not having any rainfall or high humidity, that can reduce the level of diseases that can show up. There's also increased growth rates in production. As I mentioned, we have increased heat unit accumulation and retention, and because of the plastic, you have more diffuse light distribution, and there is necessarily no wind coming through there as there would be outside, so you can reduce plant stress. And you can see here in this photograph, we have in our tunnels, this is we're excluding pests, insect pests, by putting netting around the tunnel and at the end walls. It has proven effective against several insects that we're trying to keep out of our plants. We can control the amount of water that is applied, and we end up usually with much higher quality products coming out of tunnels than you would get out of field conditions. So if you can see here, if you have the potential here for growing season right here, so the potential for total harvest, see, this is where you have traditional field cropping season, but the extended season with high tunnels, as I already mentioned, it can extend, let's say, from the beginning of spring to later in the fall. It really all depends on your geographic location and your climatic conditions that that tunnel is under. But generally speaking, we can extend the season. And you can see here our harvest season can extend both at the beginning of the season and at the end of the season. There are potentials for other crops to be grown in tunnels, figs, for example, kiwis, cherry and plums, peaches and nectarines, and grapes. Currently I have a pretty extensive project working on grapes under tunnel. And one of the great advantages of these are table grapes, one of the great advantages is disease reduction on grapes. You can see here this is a cluster of grapes being grown in the tunnel, and this is the cultivar gratitude, and you see the same cultivar being grown outside. You can see here is a lot more disease, hardly any disease berries in this in the tunnel. So let me give you again a little bit of background information on primocane fruiting blackberries. Blackberries are a perennial crop. They have a perennial crown, but their canes are biennial. That means the canes grow for 2 years and then they die. Now the canes have two different names. The first year cane is called the primocane, and this is usually a vegetative cane. And then that this cane overwinters, and then next year it will have flowers and it will bear fruit, and after bearing fruit it's going to die, and then this is called a floricane. So this is in a 2 year type production for blackberries. However, we have some blackberries similar to some of the raspberries where primocanes are can produce flowers and fruit the same year, or the first year canes, and these are called primocane fruiting blackberries or raspberries. So again, there's some potential for these primocane blackberries. One is you can have a later season in the fall for harvest. You can have the potential to schedule production based on primocane management. That is, you can reduce the amount of pruning because you can to cut these canes down in the fall, and then after harvest, and then they're gonna be overwintering, avoiding a winter injury. They're gonna overwinter, and then next year they can come up and produce a crop again later in the summer, or and but you can also, with this crop, you can also have the potential to have two crops on the same plant, because those primocanes that bear fruit in the fall, they can bear fruit in the spring also. This would be on the floricane uh, canes, and so you can then it's the possibility of having two crops in one cane in one plant. But however, in our area we have problems with primocane fruiting blackberries. The main problem is that berry production season is very short, 4 to 6 weeks, and then this production is coming in late in the summertime, where the temperatures can be pretty hot, up higher than 30 degrees, higher than centigrade. That would be about 90-ish degrees Celsius. And so this has a physiological effect on the plant. It limits flower formation and fruit set. And then sometimes, even if you have really good flower formation and fruit set, but if we end up with an early freeze, then again it limits the fruiting capabilities of the primocanes, because the fruit is not going to make it through a hard freeze. So one of the studies that we were doing is called double cropping system for organic blackberries and raspberries in high tunnels for season extension. And this was a project that was conducted by Dr. Rome, and the rest of us were also involved. Dr. Johnson, the entomologist, Heather, technician, and Jason, technicians also. This project had 3 research objectives. However, I'm going to only talk about the third objective, and that was to evaluate the double cropping fall and spring potential for the primocane fruiting blackberries and raspberries. So in this study, we had 3 blackberry cultivars, Prime Jim, Prime Jan, and APF 46. And we had 3 raspberry cultivars, Autumn Bliss, Caroline, and Dinkum. And so we were looking at extended fall production on primocanes. And then we were also looking at advanced spring production on floricanes. So the methods, the plants were planted in the spring of 2016. The row spacing about 2 feet, about 2 feet, and the row spacing is about 2 meters, 6 feet in between. The high tunnel was covered in plastic in the fall of 2006, and study ended in 2007 2009 after 3 years of croppings. And for most of our fruit production under tunnels that require cross pollination or require some kind of insect pollination, they are we buy bumblebee hives. They are brought into the tunnel, and then these are commercial hives, and then the bumblebees do a lot of the work for the pollination. So this is a couple of pictures here on the this is the outside planting, and then this is the one of the tunnels with some of the blackberry plants in there. Now I want to give you a summary of key climatic events that we had during or weather events that we had during the time that we were conducting these experiments. So let me tell you in advance, the weather did not cooperate very much with us during these 3 years. In 2006, we had very poor raspberry establishment because it was so hot and dry. The cultivar dinkum had to be replanted, and however, the blackberries did have a good survival rate. In 2007, we had what, I don't know if you remember that, the Easter freeze. We had record low temperatures in April, early April 7 and 9th. This had been followed by one of the warmest March high temperatures on record, so things were highly advanced, and so a lot of the primocane crop was lost, but there was also significant primocane damage because those canes were already about 2 feet in height. In 2008, we had a severe autumn freeze that ended the studies in late October, and then in 2009, with excessive rainfall in May and June that affected particularly the field crop, and in September and October, we also for the field crop. The study was ended in November 2007. Now, in the high tunnel environment, one of the things that we know is that it reduces the total amount of photosynthetically active radiation, which is actually a good thing. Plants seem to be doing well under lower conditions. In the spring season, the high tunnel increases the growing degree hours accumulation by about 50 to 60 growing degree hours, so it advances the phenology of the plants by about 2 to 3 weeks. It is, in some instances, protection was required, and I'll show you something in the next slide. And in the autumn season, the high tunnels prevented frost in continued fall fruiting for 3 weeks. But not in every year. Under field conditions, if you read this, under field conditions, the season ended November 1st, but in the tunnel for 2007 it was November 28th. However, in 2008, hard freeze, both the field and the high tunnel ended production at the same time. In 2009, we had production for the field going into October 28th, but we almost extended a whole month in the tunnel. Now, one thing that you need to know is that in the spring or in the fall, the tunnel can super cool in some nights depending on the weather conditions, so it requires some type of frost protection because the plants are more advanced in their growth, so As I have mentioned before, one of the advantages of high tunnels is the fact that they increase the number of growing degree hours that the plant accumulates. And that means that the plant can come into flowering or fruiting much earlier than, let's say, under field conditions where the growing degree accumulation is not as extensive. So you can see here that for the blue line, which is the tunnel, versus the green line, that is the field conditions, that we have accumulation. We have where first bloom took place in at around 550 growing degree days, and this number was reached much faster under the tunnel than it was outside. And the same thing with harvest. The growing degree days accumulated by the in the green line outside is much lower than what was achieved inside the tunnel. Now, looking at the results of this study, when we look at the three cultivars, and then you have the spring season and the autumn season, and you have the tunnel and the field, blackberries and raspberries. If you look at the blackberries, for the cultivar APF 46, there really was no significant differences in spring production. Remember, this is the Floricane production between the tunnel and the field, but there were not differences either in the autumn production for the primocanes. For prime Jan, however, there was a significant differences in yield between the tunnel and the field, both for the spring, but not in the autumn. For prime Jim, there was again significant differences between the tunnel and the field, but in this case, actually, the tunnel produced lower yields. And for raspberries, though, it did make a big difference. If you look at compare on all of the cultivars for the Floricane production, it is much higher in the tunnel than it is for the field conditions. And similar, not as pronounced, is the yield for the autumn production. Again, here, for example, for Autumn Bliss, there were 6.27 pounds per plot in the tunnel, as opposed to 2.06 pounds per plot under field conditions. If you look at berry size, there was the berries inside the tunnel, both for the blackberry and the raspberry, were slightly larger than the field berries. If you look at average harvest weight here we're comparing the spring versus the autumn, there was much higher yield for spring production or Floricane production, but there were not that much significant differences in overall harvest weights for either the spring or the autumn harvest. So, in summary of average harvest, with fruit harvested two to three times a week, there were only small differences in the average harvest weight comparing high tunnels to field plots. The tunnels tended to produce more fruit per harvest than the field plots, but not that much more. At peak harvest, tunnels produced 50% more fruit per harvest, just telling us that it actually concentrated the harvest much better than field conditions. Although marketable yields were slightly higher in tunnels, they were not significantly different from the field. And for autumn primocane production, the yield of blackberries and raspberry tended to be greater in the tunnel than in the field conditions. And particularly raspberry, responded much better than blackberries. There were no significant effect on high tunnel on average harvest and fruit size for blackberries. However, the fruit size tended to be a little bit larger. There were differences in yield due to slightly larger fruit, but not that different, and slight increase in berry number. However, we were able to extend the season in some instances, by 3 weeks. Now, some of you might put this slide just for some of you might be wondering, well, what if I were just to grow Floricane fruiting blackberries under high tunnel? And so we did this study. We had 3 cultivars, Arapaho, Navajo, and Wachita. And and again, for some of the cultivars, it made a difference for total harvest, but not really overall. It wasn't that much larger. Navajo did probably produce about 5 pounds more than in the tunnel than in the field. But but if you look here at your fruit quality again was very similar for both cases. Another study that we did, that was a mowing study. And what we were trying to figure out was if what happens if we mow the canes, the primo canes, as they begin to grow, as they reach a certain height, trying to delay the flowering of those primo canes. So we could postpone when they bloom, if they could bloom later in the season when the heat uh, is not as pronounced, then we might be able to produce more fruit. Because remember, the excessive heat in the summertime does interferes with flower bud formation and fruit development. So what we were doing here, we had 3 mowing treatments. One, the canes were mowed on May 15th. In the other one, the canes were mowed both in May 15th. When they grew a little bit more, we mowed them again. And then in the third mowing, the canes were mowed 3 times. May 15th, they grew up, we mowed them again. They grew up, and we mowed them again in June 2. The canes were tipped when they reached approximately 75 centimeters in height, and the fruit was harvested 3 times per week. And the first and the last date of harvest, total yield, and average berry weight were recorded. But however, because in our first study when we were mowing 3 times, we ended up with no fruit. And so that's probably not a choice you would be making. So we ended up changing our protocol. And so for the second year, one treatment was not mowed, and the other 2 treatments were only mowed on June 15 and June 30th. And so this is what some of the results. And if you look at this table, then 2008, 2009, and what was done, we mowed them in not mowed. This is when we had yield when we started, so August 21st. But if we mowed them in May once, then we were able to August 22nd, mowed in June 10th. If you look at these two, we were able to delay a harvest by 3 weeks. In 2009, basically the same amount. Our yields when we mowed on just once, 3.8 pounds, and then but when we mowed them again twice, then our yield really went down. And as I mentioned earlier, I didn't show it here, but when we mowed 3 times, then we did not have any yield. And again, did we have a better yield under tunnel versus field conditions? Yes, we did, but they were not significantly different. And again, the berry size, if when we mowed them in June 15, the berries were a little bit larger than when they were mown twice. In conclusion, mowing canes to the ground level later in the season produced delayed harvest as well as reduced yields. Mowing on June 15 did not delay harvest but did increase yields. High tunnels extended harvest season in 2009 when the first frosts were light, but not in 2008 when the first frost was a strong freeze. Berry size was acceptable in all. Now, one thing, question that a lot of growers ask, if I'm growing this primocane fruiters, when do I collect foliar samples for analysis? And so the objective of this study was to determine when is the best sampling date. When do you see the least amount of variation in the elemental concentrations in the leaves of the primocane fruiting blackberries? And this study was conducted both in North Carolina and in Arkansas. And basically we follow the same protocol for floricane for floricane fruiting blackberries. And so in that you actually collect leaves from the fifth node that are fully developed, and we had Wachita as a floricane fruiting cultivar for comparison. So we seem to find a period of relative stability in nutrient concentration between July 11th and July 25th. And these dates coincide with 10 to 20% primocane bloom. In both in Fayetteville and Clarksville, the 2012 the results were not conclusive, and that was probably because we had excessive heat in late June. Just letting you know who the team that has been working on this: Dr. Rome, um, myself, Dr. Pop, Dr. Johnson, and these three are technicians. These four are technicians: David, Jason, Chris, and Heather. And I want to thank the USDA for supporting us on doing this research, and Southern SARE for also providing support, the Southern Region Fruit Consortium, and the Arkansas Agriculture Department.